Hello and good day to my viewers or anyone who has stumbled across my humble YouTube channel. I'm starting a new Kerbal Space Program playthrough today that is based on a series of mods that will introduce some additional game mechanics and some additional difficulties compared to the stock game. I did dabble into making a series on this set of mods before, but that didn't end up going very far for a variety of reasons, but this time I'm hoping to get a bit further in that and showcase some of the cool features and gameplay techniques that I think get really emphasized by the set of mods that I have. So this first part of the video, I'm just going to be going over some of the basics of the mod list and some of the game configurations and I guess some of my reasoning for that. Now, a quick disclaimer before I get into that. I like to play the game the way that I like to play it, the way that's fun for me, and some of those things would be considered sacrilegious by some of the KSP community. Now, I have quite a lot of hours in this game, and given that the mod pack is a little bit more focused on difficulty and realism, there are some things like gravity turn and mech jeb that I don't have any quandaries about using, even if the odd one out might throw a fit over it. But without any further ado, let me just go through some of the core mods in this playthrough. The biggest is the JNSQ Planet Pack by the Galileo team. That is a 2.5 times rescale of the stock system with a few additional tweaks and new bodies thrown in. A lot of people have noted that the stock engines seem to be pretty balanced for the 2.5 times scale range, which allows you to increase the difficulty of the game without making it too cumbersome. On top of that, I also am using Principia, which is the famed N-body physics mod that tweaks some of the orbital mechanics to make it more realistic, albeit at the cost of my poor computer having to do exorbitant amounts of calculus. But it should allow for some interesting gameplay mechanics like Lagrange points and a little bit more realism in terms of navigating between bodies. I'm also using the Kerbalism mod. That is probably the final mod that fundamentally changes a lot of the gameplay in KSP by introducing life support systems and data for research and a host of minor complexities that add a lot of mechanics and depth to the game, in my opinion. The full mod list should be linked below. I'll try to find a way to get that up. Now, I will be using some custom difficulty settings for this playthrough. The base preset that I'm going to use is the hard preset. I'm going to allow flight reverts, allow quick saves and quick loads, and allow the other launch sites. Under the Advanced tab, I'm going to disable the Resource Transfer Obeys Crossfeed rules because I find it incredibly tedious to not be able to transfer fuel through heat shields. That is honestly the main reason. Under the Kerbalism tab, I'm going to disable the lifetime radiation. I do think that the lifetime radiation is an interesting mechanic, but I find that it ends up making the game harder because you're motivated to just max out the shielding on all of your crafts all the time, and it just adds an incredible amount of mass for you to be able to practically lift into space using the stock parts on this 2.5 times scale. And I'm also going to disable the part malfunctions toggle based on the tooltip. Now, I'm not entirely sure if that is doing what I think it does based on the tooltip, but if I'm interpreting it correctly, that should disable the engines from having random failures based on the mean time between failure. The engines should still fail when they run out of ignitions or burn time, So it should still retain that mechanic of having to use high quality engines or plan your missions according to the capabilities of your craft, without some of the annoyance that I find when it's quite annoying to launch a craft, have an engine fail on the launch pad, and immediately just have to waste 30 seconds just reverting the flight to the launch. Now with that all set up, we can get into our game here. And the first thing that I'm going to do after getting through some of these pop-ups is to head over to the Mission Control Center, as per usual, to pick up our very first contracts of this playthrough. Beginning of the game, we're going to go for pretty standard first contracts, launch the first vessel, and gather scientific data from Kerbin. The two easiest things out of those contracts that I can actually do right now, and we're going to head into the VAB to set up a quick and simple craft. We're going to grab a Mark 1 command pod, and we're going to throw some science instruments on it. Now, one of the mechanics that's added by the Kerbalism mod is the data size on experiments. So you may notice the crew report has a data size of 200 kilobytes. The capsule has a hard drive that is by default 500 kilobytes, meaning we can store 2.5 crew reports technically in the capsule before we would need to transmit or recover that data. So we shouldn't need to upgrade that at all for the moment. And we're just going to stick very simple SRB, the only engine that we actually have unlocked. And we're going to tweak the thrust down on it a bit so it's not quite so ridiculous to start off. But funnily enough, for this very first vessel, we can actually get some science just from the launch pad. Now, Kerbalism, I believe it's Kerbalism that changes this. There isn't farmable science at the KSP anymore, so we're just running the Kerbin Lowlands experiments. And the mystery goo is actually a global experiment when you're landed. And paradoxically, since we're out of electric charge from running those experiments, we may as well just go ahead and recover this craft and grab the little bit of science that it has collected thus far. But that should complete the contract for gathering scientific data from Kerbin. And we can go ahead and actually launch the rocket for real this time. It should start immediately collecting some of the flying low science in the capsule. Now, this rocket is obviously not going to get particularly far, but it should give us enough time in the atmosphere to run that mystery goo experiment. It takes about 10 minutes for the mystery goo to collect all of the data. That is one of the important, more gameplay-defining features of the Kerbalism mod, is that the experiments actually take time to run, as well as the electric power that I mentioned earlier. Now, as we do this, we are going to get, of course, a bunch of different milestone rewards as well, in addition to our contracts. And once this solid rocket booster burns out, we're just going to spend the rest of the flight coasting and try to gather some of the science. Now, it's always a little bit hairy with your first craft like this. Just so happens to be shaped like a missile. Who would have thunk that a space rocket would be the same as a missile? It will want to hurtle back towards the Earth at an absolutely ridiculous speed. We're at about 8 kilometers above sea level, going at about Mach 1.4, and desperately hoping to slow down. So we're just going to do the classic slam your fingers down on the keyboard and wiggle around until you slow down maneuver. And we are now upright. Now, that fully deployed chute is actually set to 5 kilometers for a reason. Namely, the mystery goo has not finished collecting the low atmosphere science. And we can also do a crew report for flying low over this biome. So opening that chute early will provide some time to collect the data from both of those experiments. Now, I got out here to try to get a little bit of science on EVA in this biome, but since the capsule is completely out of electric charge, the Kerbals in this mod actually do get resources in their suit from the spacecraft, and since we don't have any electric charge, we cannot make an EVA report. And unfortunately, Valentina is having quite a lot of trouble getting back into the pod, so we're just going to recover her out of the ocean and go back into the tracking station and recover the craft for the rest of the science. Now all that together has given us a grand total of about 16 science, which is enough to get some of the basic techs, get a better SRB, and importantly some additional experiments, the thermometer and the Geiger counter. And we're going to take some additional of the exploration contracts, at least the escape the atmosphere contract, since we should be able to do that relatively soon. But for now, we're just going to head back into the VAB and make a craft that can collect some more science, especially with our new experiments. We're going to unlock the new SRB we just got, and we're also going to unlock our experiments and attach them to the pod. Now, I considered putting an antenna on the pod for this, but it's not really worth the electricity cost when you're running some of these experiments that don't really have a large quantity of data. It's generally more important to save that electricity for something important, but we are just going to cheekily here sit on the launch pad and collect the Kerbin lowlands science of both of these experiments. And we're also now going to have Val go out and do her EVA report. Unfortunately, we cannot do a surface sample because the astronaut complex is still on level 1, but we'll fix that eventually. Now that we've gotten a little smidgen of extra science, we can go back into the VIB and actually make a proper rocket. And we're just going to slap the RT-10 hammer onto the bottom there, put some fins on just like we did the last one. Again, tweak the thrust to weight ratio down, and then we're going to launch. Now this rocket really did not want to behave during the launch. When you're in the early game with some of these lightweight rockets with tiny fins, they do not want to behave at all. But we eventually get it pointed in the right direction, and we can just keep burning out the SRB, and we should get a few minutes in the upper atmosphere to collect some new science again. Now, importantly, the mystery goo container only has space inside for one sample. Each experiment in a different situation is going to have a separate sample, so we have to transfer the data to the pod, which has capacity for one sample, and that will free up the inside of the goo canister doing upper atmosphere science as much as we can. This time we actually had the chute only go out at about 1 kilometer, but that should give us some time to get at least the temperature scan for the ocean biome that we're currently in. And we do have enough electricity to do some additional experiments once we have splashdown. That gives us a total of 18 science. Now, with that science, that would actually be enough to unlock the survivability tech, which will provide access to the barometer as well as some heat shields. But that's not actually quite the most important thing, in my opinion, right now, since we need to get out of the atmosphere, and we can get a lot more science out of the experiments we already have unlocked simply by giving ourselves more time in the upper atmosphere and getting ourselves into space. So what we're actually going to go ahead and do here is take this exact same craft, and we're just going to launch it again in the opposite direction. Seems a little bit counterintuitive, but we still have some science to collect from the atmosphere while we're flying, and we should also get some flying low science from some new biomes, and hopefully some landed science from some new biomes. And we're landing in the Midlands. So we will be able to collect some extra science, the crew report, temperature scan, radiation scan. However, the hard drive on this capsule is actually about to be maxed out, even though we did increase the storage space since we have more experiments we need to run. However, we can do something a little bit cheeky here. First, we're of course going to get an EVA report for that extra little bit of science. But once that EVA report is finished, we're actually going to just take the data out of the capsule and put it into Jebediah's inventory and recover him, which will give us most of the science, and will actually allow the pod to use the rest of its electricity to finish off the experiments that it didn't quite have space for, namely the radiation scan. Those additional science points will actually give us the science to unlock the general rocketry tech, which will give us some much more powerful rocket equipment, and we're going to put that to immediate use to try to escape the atmosphere for the first time. So we're going to have a capsule that's largely the same setup, and beneath that we're going to have a liquid-fueled stage, and the launch stage will be the new solid rocket booster that we just unlocked. Now, the vehicle assembly building does have a limit of 18 tons, so we do have to tweak the fuel down on one of the tanks a little bit, unfortunately, but that should still be more than enough to escape the atmosphere. Now, there is one tiny hiccup that the observant among you may notice. This rocket does not have a decoupler beneath the capsule. Yes, I had to revert the flight once and add that decoupler back in. And yes, I am in fact that scatterbrained, which is why I enabled the revert flights and the quick save, quick load, especially with some of the additional difficulty of this mod set. We've also included an antenna, since we're going to be collecting more science from multiple different situations, and the liquid-fueled engine will actually provide a source of electricity to run that transmitter through its alternator. The solid rocket booster is much stronger, and despite the fact that the TWR was cranked down to about 1.4 on the launch pad, it's already up to a thrust-to-weight ratio of almost 2.5, less than a minute into the flight. So we'll have to quite aggressively pitch down in order to get a good gravity turn going, which is made more difficult by the fact that, again, our fins aren't really doing anything for us in terms of maneuverability. They're just keeping the craft a bit more stable. This solid fuel booster has already gotten our apoapsis up to about 50 kilometers, which is quite respectable for the first stage, and then we can decouple that and head on to our upper stage. Now with this upper stage, we're not actually going to burn up, we're going to continue to burn sideways just so that we can get as much forward velocity as possible to give ourselves hopefully a good few minutes of time in space before we inevitably come screeching down back to Earth. Now, since I'm not too worried about being super precise with getting into orbit, I eventually found this good point at about 2/3 throttle and this particular attitude, and I'm just going to let the upper stage burn all the way out. And once that stage is complete, we actually ended up with an apoapsis of about 94 kilometers. So we should have a good 3 or 4 minutes in space. Not a whole lot, but enough to collect some ever valuable science points. We've also completed our contract to escape the atmosphere, which gives us some more money and some more science. And I believe we also got a few milestone rewards along the way there as well. Now, this entry will really show how brutal some of the re-entry can be with this much larger planet, where I'm entering the atmosphere much faster, despite the fact that I'm only entering on a suborbital trajectory, and despite how high up on the capsule some of these experiments are mounted. We are going to lose a few of these experiments due to the re-entry heating. I tried to give the capsule a roll that can oftentimes get some of the side parts to not be quite so exposed to the heat and survive a little bit longer, but alas, it was not enough in this case. And both the temperature scan and the mystery goo experiment exploded during the re-entry, which did lose us some science since I had not transferred that data into the capsule. The important thing, though, is that we still have some science on the craft, in addition to what we transmitted back, and Valentina is still alive. Now, once we splash down, we are in a new sea biome, so we can at least get a radiation scan and a crew report, if nothing else. After the last messing about with Valentina in the ocean, I decided that I didn't want to cheese the game by going on EVA. I just recovered the capsule despite the fact that the storage was full, and we didn't quite get every little last science point. But we are now up to 29 science points, despite the fact that we just spent 20 of them on the rocketry tech. And that will allow us to invest in the survivability tech, which will importantly give us access to the barometer and the heat shield. Now, while I'm quite excited to make good use of these parts and expanding our space program even further, I think that's all I have time for today. We made some good baby steps with about 3 flights, 5 if you count sitting on the launch pad running some instruments, and we've knocked out 4 of the techs and gotten ourselves quite a good start. We've got a bunch of funds and a bunch of science, and we should be set up to do even better things next time. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and want to see more. And I will see you guys in the next one.